I first laid eyes on Maplewood Estates on a breezy afternoon in late spring. The wide boulevard at the entrance was lined with fresh mulberry trees, their newly budded leaves shimmering under a gentle sun. The promotional brochures for Maplewood Estates showed smiling families, pristine sidewalks, and uniform rows of attached townhomes, each with its own modest porch and a little patch of manicured greenery out front. The day I moved in, I held on to the hope that this community might be the perfect combination of suburban calm and friendly neighbors. I had grown up in cities where the hustle made it easy to stay anonymous, so the idea of an HOA neighborhood, while slightly intimidating, was also appealing. Organized block parties, well-maintained shared spaces, and a sense of collective pride. What could be so bad? Within a week, I caught wind of the name on everyone's lips. Harriet Farnsworth, a middle-aged woman with coiffed brown hair, impeccably ironed blouses, and a gaze sharp enough to spot a misplaced garden ornament from half a block away. Neighbors had a single, telling nickname for her: Karen. I didn't grasp the extent of her reputation until my second day. While I was arranging moving boxes in my garage, Harriet appeared unannounced. She stood stiffly by the door, introducing herself as the enforcement arm of the Homeowners Association. I noticed she clutched a leather-bound binder of rules, already filled with color-coded tabs. She politely, though with an unmistakable edge, reminded me that garage doors should remain closed except for legitimate loading or unloading purposes. I'd only had it open for ventilation. The next morning, I found an official note stuffed in my mailbox, a friendly reminder about compliance with the association's guidelines. The text was printed in stern font, closed with Harriet's signature. It was a minor annoyance, to be sure, but her watchful presence planted a seed of unease. It became clear Maplewood Estates was a place of outward charm and inward tensions, all revolving around Harriet Farnsworth, a one-woman bureaucracy who took civic responsibility to an extreme. Like many homeowners associations, Maplewood Estates was meant to keep the neighborhood orderly and ensure everyone pitched in for shared amenities. We had a clubhouse for communal gatherings, a pool area open during the warm months, and a wide central corridor spanning several of the attached townhomes. The corridor functioned like an internal walkway, a place to access second-floor units or to store strollers and bicycles temporarily. HOA rules, by design, maintain a uniform look and feel. Typically, that means you can't paint your door neon pink or let your lawn grow waist-high. But under Harriet Farnsworth's guidance, the HOA's rulebook grew monstrous, stuffed with obscure clauses about the exact height of holiday ornaments or the permissible brand of porch light bulbs. Even the mildest infractions, like failing to bring your trash bin indoors within an hour of pickup, could trigger Harriet's disapproving scowl and, worse yet, a formal warning letter. It wasn't just that Harriet was controlling. It was how she derived palpable satisfaction from putting others in their place. Her posture, her clipped tone, her constant references to our covenants lent her an air of authority that few dared challenge. In my first few weeks, I realized Harriet had special ire for anything related to children or childish chaos, as she called it. Residents whispered that she had once posted flyers urging parents to keep noisy toddlers inside after 7 p.m. Some believed her animosity stemmed from her own experiences, though no one had the full story. Regardless, Harriet seemed to see children as a threat to the quiet order she cherished. Meanwhile, Maplewood Estates was hardly a retirement community. It attracted young families, couples with infants, and single parents looking for a safe neighborhood. Harriet's attitudes were out of step with the changing demographic, creating an undercurrent of resentment. Still, for a while, it was mostly small skirmishes. A kid's bicycle left in the hallway, a sidewalk chalk drawing Harriet deemed graffiti, or strollers parked a foot too far from the assigned area. No one suspected how quickly and dramatically her need for control would escalate. Over the following month, Harriet's presence became more noticeable. Twice I saw her early in the morning, patrolling with a clipboard, checking for overnight violations, like an unauthorized vehicle parked on the street. Another time, I glimpsed her scolding a teenage boy for skateboarding near the entrance. My neighbor across the hall, Cora Williams, was a single mom with a toddler named Evan. She often confided in me how Harriet's constant meddling made her anxious. Harriet had already left repeated notes for Cora about excessive foot traffic in the shared corridor. Another time, Harriet confronted Cora at the mailboxes, remarking that strollers ought to be stowed inside your unit, not left in a common area. But how am I supposed to carry the groceries and hold Evan at the same time? Cora vented to me one afternoon. I keep the stroller folded up to the side, not blocking anything. She tried explaining that her hands were full, but Harriet never showed the slightest empathy. Her stance was always, rules are rules. Cora's was not the only story of Harriet's hostility toward families. A couple with twin infants had faced Harriet's wrath for letting their double stroller rest near the entrance. Another neighbor told me Harriet once demanded a father remove a small baby swing from the front porch, calling it visual clutter. Although Harriet never explicitly said she hated children, her unrelenting nitpicking about any baby-related items spoke volumes. And because Harriet chaired the enforcement committee within the HOA, appealing her decisions was a dreaded ordeal. By now, the rumor mill was swirling. Some believed Harriet was pushing for an amendment that would limit child-oriented accessories in common areas. The hush-hush talk was that she planned to propose designated child-free hours for the shared courtyard. It sounded outlandish, yet not beyond Harriet's brand of bureaucratic tyranny. Despite Harriet's bullying, no one expected an actual act of aggression. After all, Harriet mostly stayed within the realm of letters, scowls, and threats. But tension was building. Many neighbors had grown tired of Harriet's constant complaints. At monthly HOA meetings, people started whispering among themselves, floating the idea of voting Harriet off the board. However, Harriet's knowledge of the association's legal intricacies gave her an edge. She always seemed to deflect challenges with skillful references to bylaws or parliamentary procedure. Meanwhile, I noticed Harriet's mood growing more brittle. The once impeccable facade of calm arrogance now revealed flashes of irritation at the slightest mention of children's activities. At one meeting, she slammed her binder on the table when a parent tried to argue for more leniency on storing strollers. "We can't allow personal convenience to override community standards," she barked, cheeks flushed with anger. That same evening, Harriet typed up a 3-page memo about proper hallway usage, which insisted that absolutely nothing, no shoes, no umbrellas, no strollers, be left in corridors or entryways. This struck people as impractical. If you had an upstairs unit, how were you supposed to carry a heavy stroller up those steps every time, especially with a baby in tow? Even the friendliest neighbors muttered complaints, sharing the frustration of feeling singled out. Harriet's ever-expanding web of rules cast a pall over day-to-day life in Maplewood Estates, and the friction was palpable. A few nights before the Walker incident, I bumped into Harriet near the mail kiosk. She was carrying a bright orange notice in her hand. I recognized it as one of those final warnings about repeated infractions. She seemed so incensed by something that she didn't even greet me with her usual stiff-lipped half-smile. Her eyes were fixed on the second-floor corridor window, as though she already had a new target in mind. I couldn't shake a feeling of dread that Harriet was on the verge of crossing a line no one thought she'd cross. The day came, unremarkable at first. It was late afternoon, warm and slightly humid, and many neighbors were returning from work or errands. I recall that I had just come back from a grocery run. My arms were loaded with bags, and I paused in the shared corridor that led to the stairs. I was headed to my second-floor unit, but the first thing I noticed was a baby walker, the kind with bright plastic attachments and a padded seat, positioned near the landing. I didn't think much of it. People with small children often left baby gear momentarily while they juggled doors, keys, or crying little ones. This walker, though, was empty, no baby inside, just a stationary item left in a corner, presumably so the parent could quickly dash back to their unit to grab something. Within seconds, I heard the echo of footsteps. Harriet Farnsworth appeared at the far end of the corridor, her expression already set to disapprove. She spotted the walker in less than a second, eyes narrowing like a hawk. I braced myself for a lecture. Perhaps she'd wave her binder or spout policy numbers. But the anger in her face was unlike anything I'd seen. She marched straight toward the walker, her heels clacking sharply on the tiled floor. Her voice came out in a low hiss. "I have told you people 100 times, no personal belongings in the hallway." She shot a glance at me, as if assuming I was responsible. I opened my mouth to explain that it wasn't mine, but she cut me off, spitting out, This is a violation. You cannot just dump your baby contraptions here for everyone else to trip on. If you have a child, keep them inside your own unit." Before I could respond, Harriet did the unthinkable. She kicked the baby walker. At first, it was just a nudge, as if to push it aside. But something in her snapped, maybe frustration, maybe rage, and her foot thrust forward again, this time forceful enough that the walker lurched, teetered, and tumbled to the top of the stairs. Then, with a final, violent kick, Harriet sent the walker careening down the steps. It clattered and bounced, plastic parts snapping off as it banged against each concrete edge. There was a shriek from the staircase below. A woman, June Morales, the mother who owned the walker, watched in horror as the device careened toward her. By sheer luck, her baby wasn't inside. She had left the walker for a moment to grab the child's bottle from her car. But Harriet's face showed no relief. If anything, she looked triumphant, as though teaching a lesson. June froze, and the mangled walker crashed to a stop near her feet. She scooped it up, her eyes wide with shock. "What? Why? How could you?" she stammered, voice trembling. Harriet still stood on the landing above, glaring down like a stern judge pronouncing sentence. "Go cradle them indoors," Harriet barked, cheeks aflame. "These halls are not for storing your brat's toys. I'm fed up with it." The silence that followed Harriet's outburst was momentarily deafening. It was as if the corridor itself inhaled in disbelief. I saw Harriet's lips twitch. For a moment, it seemed she might climb down the stairs to continue scolding June. But something in my expression, or the searing stares from onlookers, made her hesitate. "Unbelievable," I muttered, dropping my grocery bags and rushing to check if June was okay. The bright yellow walker lay cracked and twisted on the bottom step, tiny wheels spinning uselessly. My heart pounded at the realization that if the baby had been in that seat, the child could have been severely injured, or worse. June was shaking, on the verge of tears. I went to the car. If Evan had been in there," she whispered in shock. She clutched the wrecked walker as if trying to protect it in hindsight. Neighbors started emerging from their units, drawn by the commotion. Within a minute, a small crowd gathered. Harriet stood rigidly at the top of the stairs, her face coloring with both anger and embarrassment. It seemed she realized that she'd gone too far, but her body language screamed defiance. She snapped, "This is what happens when people ignore the rules. Hallways are not storage rooms." A flurry of accusations burst from the onlookers. "How dare you do that? You could have hurt a child. You're out of control, Harriet. I'm calling the police. That's destruction of property." Amid the uproar, Harriet offered no apology. Instead, she brandished her phone, snapping a few pictures of the walkway as if building a case. She insisted violations must be dealt with. This is in the best interest of everyone's safety. Then, with a curt toss of her hair, she walked off, leaving half the corridor in shock. A shaken June looked up at me, tears threatening to spill. "I can't believe she did that. What if?" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Several neighbors started consoling her, some offering to help replace the damaged walker. A few, outraged beyond words, insisted Harriet be charged with reckless endangerment. Others grumbled that Harriet had to be removed from power. That day, Harriet Farnsworth crossed a line, no longer just an overbearing rule enforcer, but a menace who put a child's safety at risk. The repercussions were about to ripple through Maplewood Estates in ways she hadn't anticipated. Word of the Walker incident spread like wildfire. By the next morning, the Maplewood Estates social media group was ablaze with posts detailing Harriet's shocking act. Some neighbors typed furious tirades, demanding Harriet's immediate resignation from the HOA board. Others shared messages of support for June and her baby, relieved that no one had been physically hurt. Mr. Bowers, a longtime resident and one of the few who'd always tried to give Harriet the benefit of the doubt, posted a measured but firm condemnation. "Regardless of our rules, forcibly kicking a baby walker down the stairs is unacceptable. We must re-examine our leadership." His post garnered dozens of likes and comments agreeing with him. Meanwhile, Harriet stayed conspicuously silent online, presumably to avoid fueling the flame war. But she still roamed the neighborhood, patrolling with the same rigid posture. She confronted a few parents who had posted negative remarks, threatening them with defamation suits or fines for ongoing hallway violations. This only amplified the backlash. Some neighbors began discussing potential legal options. Could Harriet be sued for property damage? Possibly. Could she face criminal charges for endangering a minor, even if the baby wasn't actually in the walker? Potentially, though the situation was murky. June, for her part, was too shaken to mount a big legal battle. She told me that all she wanted was an apology and the guarantee that Harriet would never do something like that again. My baby could have been in there, she'd say, her voice trembling. That's all I think about. Across Maplewood Estates, people started sharing personal stories of Harriet's intimidation. Some recounted borderline harassing behavior, like repeated letters over minor yard issues or midnight knocks on doors to lecture about leaving porch lights on. The Walker incident became a catalyst. Neighbors realized Harriet was more than a harmless busybody. She was a real threat to peace and safety. The uproar was so intense that the other HOA board members scheduled an emergency meeting. Usually, board meetings took place in a small conference room at the clubhouse, with an agenda full of mundane items, landscaping costs, roofing repairs, the quarterly budget. This time, the hall was packed to capacity with angry residents. Harriet arrived exactly on time, binder in hand, shoulders squared. You could sense the tension the moment she walked in. People glared or whispered under their breath. The board president, a soft-spoken retiree named Wallace Hicks, tried to maintain decorum but looked visibly uneasy. "Let's call this meeting to order," Wallace said, rapping a small gavel. "We've called you all here to address a serious complaint, the alleged vandalism of personal property in the corridor. We want to hear from those involved." June's voice was shaky as she recounted the incident. "I stepped away to get my baby's bottle from the car, left the walker by the stairs. Before I could come back, Harriet Farnsworth, she kicked it down the steps. It's broken beyond repair. My child wasn't in it, but that walker was a gift from my mother." She paused, fighting back tears. What if Evan had been inside? It's terrifying. Wallace nodded sympathetically. All eyes turned to Harriet, who stood. In a steely voice, she offered her explanation. The walker blocked a common passageway, in direct violation of Section 7.2 of our bylaws. It posed a safety hazard for other residents. I acted impulsively, perhaps, but out of concern for compliance. She pursed her lips. We cannot allow personal convenience to jeopardize shared safety. I regret that some find my actions extreme, but I was within my rights to enforce community standards. The room erupted in gasps and angry muttering. Harriet's statement lacked even a shred of remorse for potentially harming a child or scaring the mother. People peppered her with questions. What if the baby had been there? How is violence an acceptable method of enforcement? You could have called security instead of kicking it. Harriet's face tightened. She replied in clipped sentences about zero tolerance for hazards and precedent for swift action. Even Wallace, who generally tried to stay impartial, looked appalled. In the end, the board deferred a decision on Harriet's potential removal. They cited the need to conduct a formal investigation and gather statements from witnesses. The meeting ended with tension so thick you could practically taste it. Outside, neighbors huddled in groups, discussing how to hold Harriet accountable. Some talked about launching a recall petition. Others, though outraged, worried Harriet would manipulate the rules to stay in power. All agreed that a line had been crossed, and Maplewood Estates would never be the same. For days after the emergency meeting, the atmosphere in Maplewood Estates was electric with anger and fear. Harriet continued her regular enforcement rounds, but now she faced open hostility from some neighbors. People would deliberately leave strollers or small baby items in the corridor, acts of protest that dared Harriet to lash out again. Others simply avoided her as if she carried the plague. June, emotionally shaken, stayed mostly indoors, not wanting to face Harriet or relive the trauma. A few supportive neighbors organized a small fundraiser to help replace her damaged walker. They purchased a new one, this time a more advanced model with extra safety features. When they delivered it to June's door, she broke down in grateful tears. Meanwhile, rumors swirled that Harriet might hire a lawyer to defend herself against the ongoing investigation. The word investigation gave the board some leeway to claim neutrality, but everyone knew Harriet was intimately tied to half of them through social circles. Nonetheless, the pressure to do something was immense. Parents demanded better guidelines for strollers and baby gear. Older residents expressed concern that Harriet's temper could flare again, maybe next time directed at them. Amid the chaos, something fascinating began to happen. Neighbors who rarely interacted started forming alliances. People realized Harriet's aggression was a wake-up call. If she could do that to a baby walker, who knew what else she might do under the guise of enforcing rules? A resident named Jonas, father of two, started a petition demanding reasonable accommodations for families. It gathered signatures at a record pace. Cora Williams, my neighbor across the hall, led the charge on social media, posting updates about the petition. "We are not going to let Maplewood Estates become a place where parents fear for their children's well-being," she wrote. "Let's show Harriet that compassion and safety come first." Her post was shared so widely that the board had no choice but to take notice. The seeds of a collective movement were planted, one that Harriet couldn't stomp out simply by citing bylaws. In the midst of this turmoil, a small group of concerned residents, parents, grandparents, even a few single folks, came together to propose child-friendly measures for Maplewood Estates. Their biggest demand: clearly designated spaces for strollers, baby walkers, and other child-related items in common areas, so parents wouldn't have to lug everything up or down multiple flights of stairs. They also requested the installation of safer railings and baby gates at the top of each stairwell. The idea was to ensure that if a child did wander into a hallway, the risk of toppling down steps was minimized. A more ambitious suggestion involved building a gentle ramp to make it easier for strollers and walkers to move in and out of units on the second floor. Under normal circumstances, Harriet would have dismissed these proposals as unnecessary extravagances. But now, Harriet found herself cornered by public outrage. When the group submitted their proposals to the board, Harriet tried to push back with her usual arguments about maintaining aesthetic standards or avoiding clutter. This time, though, a majority of the board and the community wasn't having it. The momentum had shifted. People openly pointed to Harriet's walker-kicking incident as exactly why these changes were needed, so no angry individual could sabotage baby equipment in a moment of rage. The board president, Wallace Hicks, recognized that ignoring these demands would only further inflame tensions. He scheduled a meeting with a contractor to discuss how to install child-friendly ramps. He even solicited feedback from parents on the best spot for a stroller parking nook in the corridor. Harriet fumed. At one informal gathering, she complained to a small circle of her loyal supporters that kids are going to take over Maplewood Estates. She claimed it would drive away respectable residents who expected tidy, adult-oriented spaces. Yet her influence was clearly waning, overshadowed by the outrage she had ignited through her own impulsive actions. Ironically, her violent reaction to the baby walker was catalyzing the exact opposite outcome. Maplewood Estates would soon be more family-friendly than ever. A few weeks later, changes began. The first visible sign was the installation of baby gates at the top of each stairwell. They were sturdy, easily locked, and built to code. A safety measure that parents had long dreamed of became reality, practically overnight. Next came the partial ramp, just a small incline near the steps, allowing strollers and baby walkers to be wheeled up without major lifting. Many residents volunteered to help with these installations, painting railings and smoothing out the ramp. Even those without children found satisfaction in improving accessibility. Some seniors with mild mobility issues appreciated the ramp, too. The sense of communal effort was uplifting, a stark contrast to the stifled environment Harriet had previously enforced. By the time the finishing touches were done, Maplewood Estates boasted a more welcoming environment for young families. The new signage clarified that strollers and walkers could be stored in designated alcoves, away from the main flow of foot traffic. Guidelines were posted, but they were pragmatic rather than punitive. Please fold your stroller after use and place it in the stroller nook to keep hallways clear. No mention of fines or ominous threats. It was the exact opposite of Harriet's approach. Throughout this transformation, Harriet simmered on the sidelines. She wrote a few pointed letters to the board, criticizing the costs of the ramp and baby gates. She demanded an itemized breakdown of every expense, scouring for something she could call misuse of HOA funds. But the board, now more unified and supported by the residents, calmly rebutted every complaint. They pointed out that these modifications enhanced safety and accessibility for all. Worst of all for Harriet, The updated community guidelines explicitly allowed for short-term placement of baby equipment in the hallway, as long as it was within those designated areas. Her initial reason for punting the walker, no personal belongings in common areas, was effectively nullified. The message was clear. Parents in Maplewood Estates would not be forced to confine their child-related needs entirely behind closed doors. Harriet's bullying had inadvertently hastened the neighborhood's pivot to a more family-oriented policy. As Maplewood Estates transformed, Harriet's once daunting presence began to shrink. She was still on the HOA board, but calls for her resignation grew louder. A group of parents collected over 100 signatures requesting she step down, citing conduct unbecoming of a community leader for her violent outburst. Harriet, backed by a small minority of older residents who found children noisy or disruptive, refused to budge. She claimed the petition was invalid and threatened lawsuits if they proceeded with what she deemed a defamatory campaign. In casual conversation, hardly anyone referred to Harriet by her real name. The nickname Karen had fully stuck, conjuring images of her meltdown at the top of the stairs. Even those who once sympathized with Harriet's desire for order found themselves uncomfortable with the extremes she was willing to go. Rumors circulated that Harriet's husband, who traveled for business, was mortified by the scandal. Yet Harriet herself seemed too entrenched in her self-righteous stance to admit fault. Sometimes Harriet still patrolled the neighborhood, taking pictures of minor landscaping issues or measuring the length of grass blades. But the difference now was that people no longer cowered. Residents would greet her with a curt, "Hello, Karen," and keep walking. Children who used to dart indoors at her approach would continue playing, ignoring her. Harriet was forced to watch from the sidelines as Maplewood Estates embraced an air of newfound openness. She had tried to tighten her grip on the community, only to watch that grip slip away entirely. Although June didn't initially pursue a lawsuit, some neighbors urged her to press charges for vandalism or endangerment. Ultimately, local authorities treated the matter as a civil dispute rather than a criminal one, especially since the baby wasn't in the walker. The police questioned Harriet, who insisted she never intended to harm a child. Without undisputed proof of malicious intent, the case never escalated into a formal charge. Harriet lawyered up and stonewalled. At one point, June considered filing a small claims suit to cover the cost of the walker and emotional distress. But the community had already replaced the walker, and June just wanted peace. The memory of Harriet's foot smashing into her baby's belongings was haunting enough. She didn't want a lengthy, stressful legal battle. Meanwhile, Harriet reveled in her technical victory, telling a few supporters that the lack of charges exonerated her. Most residents, however, saw it differently. Just because she skated past the legal system doesn't mean she's innocent, one neighbor remarked online. We all know what she did was wrong. She's lucky the baby wasn't in that seat. In a neighborhood that once tolerated Harriet's overreach for fear of fines, a new spirit of defiance blossomed. People formed volunteer committees to handle minor complaints instead of running to Harriet. Some neighbors learned how to interpret the bylaws themselves, preemptively challenging Harriet's misrepresentations. The intangible power Harriet had wielded for so long was slipping through her fingers. As time passed, Maplewood Estates settled into its new reality. Child-friendly improvements remained in place. Despite Harriet's repeated attempts to undermine them, the board voted to keep the ramps, gates, and designated storage spots for strollers and walkers as permanent fixtures. Surprisingly, these measures benefited a broader swath of residents. A few elderly homeowners in wheelchairs or using walkers themselves expressed gratitude for the modifications, praising the ramp that made their daily routines easier. Families with newborns felt more welcome and less stressed about the logistics of hauling baby gear upstairs. Even pet owners discovered the gates helped prevent pets from darting off. June gradually overcame her shock. I saw her smiling more often, going for walks with her baby in the new stroller. She told me that while she'd never forget Harriet's aggression, she found solace in how the neighborhood united afterward. This whole thing made me feel less alone, she admitted. The fact that so many people stood by me and helped push for changes, it's amazing. Cora, my neighbor across the hall, concurred. She noticed how Maplewood Estates had become warmer, friendlier. Neighbors who once only nodded in passing now chatted, swapped baby clothes, or brought meals to new parents. The sense of community Harriet had tried to force through rigid enforcement ironically blossomed only after people banded together against her extreme behavior. Months rolled on, and Harriet Farnsworth, Karen, remained on the HOA board in a diminished capacity. She still insisted on clinging to her position, either out of stubborn pride or a refusal to concede defeat. However, the rest of the board increasingly voted against her proposals. She found herself outvoted on nearly every measure, from landscaping budgets to holiday decorations. The community had learned how to stand firm. Whenever Harriet attempted to resurrect her draconian rules, like banning strollers in hallways altogether, someone would remind her of the baby gates and the updated policy. "We have designated spots now," they'd say. "You can't override that unilaterally." Harriet would grow silent, the corners of her mouth twitching. She couldn't undo the new child-friendly modifications because they were codified by a majority, and the neighborhood was resolute in keeping them. Every so often, a new family would move into Maplewood Estates, nervous about the tales of the dreaded Karen. They'd ask about the rumored Walker incident, and neighbors would confirm, yes, it happened, but the community had come out stronger for it. Harriet would greet the newcomers with her usual frosty politeness, yet they heard the story anyway, and learned to keep their guard up. Ironically, Harriet's violent outburst resulted in exactly what she feared, a more vibrant environment that welcomed families. She had unwittingly sponsored a transformation that undermined her controlling approach. Parents no longer had to hide strollers or keep children indoors. Instead, they had the community's blessing to navigate the hallways freely, assured that no one, not even Harriet Farnsworth, would dare take a boot to their belongings again. On a crisp autumn morning nearly a year after the infamous Walker incident, I found myself standing outside Maplewood Estates' refurbished clubhouse. A small gathering was underway, neighbors celebrating the installation of a new playground in the previously empty common lawn. Children toddled around, climbing on safe, modern play structures. Parents mingled, sipping coffee, chatting about everyday life. June was there, holding her toddler Evan's hand as he tried the small slide. She waved when she saw me. "Isn't this wonderful? I never thought we'd have a play area here." I nodded, recalling the once sterile, child-unfriendly grounds that Harriet had championed. I spotted Harriet at a distance, alone, her expression stony. She hovered near the fence, binder under her arm, occasionally checking her watch. She was present, but excluded from the real celebration, an onlooker to the warm, communal atmosphere she had worked so hard to suppress. Maybe she was writing notes for a future complaint, or maybe she was forced to accept that the neighborhood had permanently moved past her old ways. As I watched Harriet slip away, a curious thought struck me. Even in the face of relentless interference, genuine community can't be stifled forever. One ill-tempered kick had awakened neighbors to the power of collective action, forging a unity Harriet never managed to cultivate with her memos and warnings. Maplewood Estates was far from perfect. There would always be small disputes and petty squabbles, but now, the neighbors had each other's backs. And in that sense, Harriet Farnsworth's greatest legacy was the very thing she had once tried to extinguish: a child-friendly, supportive environment where watchers became friends, and parents felt safe letting their kids roam. In the end, Maplewood Estates had discovered that real harmony comes not from rigid rules, but from empathy and shared purpose, making it a home in every sense of the word.